The coat smelled of cedar and something darker. Ink, perhaps, or smoke. And it was the only reason I did not die on the road to Thornfield. I need you to understand that I am not a thief. Or perhaps I am. Perhaps that is what desperation makes of us. Thieves, liars, survivors. And the only difference between a criminal and a woman with no choices is whether anyone with power cares to hear the distinction. It was November, and the rain had turned to ice. I had been walking for 6 hours. My boots had soaked through before the 2nd mile, and by the 4th, I had stopped feeling my feet entirely. The road north from Ipswich was empty. No coaches, no carts, no one fool enough to be out in weather that felt like the sky was trying to kill you personally. Except me. And except the carriage. It was stopped at an angle in a ditch just past the crossroads, one wheel shattered, the horses gone, cut loose or bolted. The door hung open like a mouth mid-scream. No driver, no passengers. Just an overturned trunk spilling its contents into the mud, and draped across the seat inside, heavy and dark and impossibly dry, a man's greatcoat. I stood in the road and stared at it, shaking so violently my vision blurred. I did not know whose coat it was. I only knew I would freeze without it. I took it. My name is Arabella Locke, and 3 months before I stole a duke's coat from a ditch in Suffolk, I had a father, a home, and a future that, while not grand, was ours. My father was George Locke, a wool merchant of moderate success in Norwich. He was not wealthy, but he was respected, a man who kept his word, paid his debts, and provided for his daughter with the quiet, steady devotion of someone who had lost his wife early and poured everything that remained into the one person she left behind. I was that person, and I was not enough to save him. The trouble began with a man named Ridley. Charles Ridley, a London broker who arrived in Norwich with a proposition. A joint venture, a shipping contract, wool to the continent at prices that would triple my father's income. The terms were generous. The introductions were impeccable. The references, my father later discovered, were forged. Ridley took everything. The investment, the operating capital, the credit my father had built over 20 years. When the scheme collapsed, when the ships turned out to be fictitious and the contracts worthless, my father was left holding debts he could not pay to creditors who did not care that he had been deceived. He went to London to plead his case. He wrote letters to magistrates, to solicitors, to anyone who might help him recover what had been stolen. Every door closed. Every avenue led to the same wall. And behind that wall, I later learned, stood one name: the Duke of Ashcroft. Ridley was his man. Not formally, nothing so traceable, but Ridley operated under the Duke's protection, used the Duke's connections to build his credibility, and when the scheme collapsed, it was the Duke's solicitor who ensured that no investigation proceeded and no charges were brought. My father's petition to the Court of Chancery was blocked by an attorney retained by the Ashcroft estate. His letters to Parliament were intercepted by a secretary who owed the Duke a favour. Every path to justice bent around this man like water around a stone. My father hanged himself in his study on the 14th of September. I found him. I will not describe it. Some things live in the body, not in words, and that morning lives in mine like a second skeleton, always there, always holding me in a shape I did not choose. The creditors took the house. The furniture, the silver, my mother's piano, my father's books, all of it seized, inventoried, and sold. I was permitted to keep my clothing and a small trunk of personal effects. A solicitor's clerk explained this to me with the bored patience of someone who had delivered this speech many times. "Have you family, Miss Locke?" I had an aunt in Thornfield, my mother's sister, whom I had not seen in 9 years. She had written once, after my mother's death, a brief, dutiful letter, and once more when I turned 18, offering vague hospitality should I ever find myself in the north. I was now in the north, or trying to be. With £6, a trunk I had abandoned at a coaching inn when I could no longer afford the fare, and the clothes on my back. And now, a stolen coat. I walked through the night. The coat saved me. There is no other way to say it. It was enormous, heavy wool lined with something softer, and it fell past my knees and turned me into a shapeless, dark creature, stumbling through the frozen countryside. I pulled the collar up over my ears and buried my hands in the pockets, and in the right pocket, my fingers found a folded paper. I could not read it in the dark. I pressed on. By dawn, I had reached the village of Thornfield, a scatter of stone houses around a church, a public house, and a forge. My aunt's cottage was at the eastern edge, beside the mill stream, exactly where my mother had described it in a story she told me when I was 7. Aunt Marian's house has a blue door and a pear tree that drops fruit onto the path every autumn, and if you visit, she will make you plum cake. The door was blue. The pear tree was bare. And Aunt Marian, when she opened the door to find her dead sister's daughter swaying on the step in a man's greatcoat 3 sizes too large, looked at me with an expression that was equal parts horror and resignation. "Arabella?" "I have nowhere else to go," I said. She pulled me inside. Aunt Marian was a widow, childless, living on a small annuity and the goodwill of a village that valued her skill with herbs and remedies. Her cottage was warm, cluttered with dried lavender and jars of tincture, and smelled of beeswax and thyme. She fed me broth, wrapped me in blankets, and did not ask questions until I had slept for 14 hours. When I woke, I told her everything. My father, Ridley, the debts, the Duke of Ashcroft. At the name, her face changed. "Ashcroft," she repeated. "You are certain?" His solicitor blocked every petition. His name is on every refusal my father received. He sheltered the man who destroyed us. Marian set down her teacup with a care that told me she was choosing her next words very deliberately. "Arabella, the Duke of Ashcroft's estate is 4 miles from this village. Thornfield sits on the border of his land. Half the men in this parish work his fields or tend his timber. The vicar dines at his table once a month." The floor tilted beneath me. "You are telling me I have fled to his doorstep." "I am telling you that in this village, the name Ashcroft is not spoken carelessly." She looked at me. Really looked. The way my mother used to. Seeing everything I was trying to hide. "What is that coat you arrived in?" I had draped it over the chair by the fire. In daylight, I could see it properly for the first time. Dark charcoal wool, exquisitely tailored, with silver buttons stamped with a crest I had been too frozen and too desperate to examine in the dark. Marian crossed the room and turned back the collar. Embroidered inside, in thread so dark it was nearly invisible. A. We looked at each other. "The paper," I said, "in the pocket." I retrieved it with fingers that had gone cold again despite the fire. Unfolded it. A letter, half finished, in a bold, slanting hand. "Ridley, your accounts do not reconcile. I have sent Hale to examine the Norwich matter personally. If what I suspect is true, you have operated outside every boundary I set, and I will not." The letter ended there. Unfinished. Unsigned. But the hand was confident, aristocratic, and furious. I read it 3 times. My understanding of what it meant shifted with each reading, and with each shift, the ground beneath my hatred cracked a little wider. If what I suspect is true. He had suspected. He had sent someone to investigate. You have operated outside every boundary I set. Ridley had not been following orders. He had been exceeding them. I will not. Will not what? Protect him? Tolerate it? Save him? The letter was unfinished. The carriage had been wrecked. The horses were gone, the driver absent, the trunk overturned in the mud. Something had happened on that road, something violent and unresolved. And I was standing in a warm cottage, wearing the evidence. He came on the 3rd day. I was in Marian's garden, cutting back the dead growth from her herb beds, a task I had volunteered for because it kept my hands busy and my mind from circling the same dark orbit it had followed since September. The air was sharp and clear, the kind of cold that makes everything look etched in glass. I heard the horse before I saw the rider. When I looked up, a man was dismounting at the garden gate, and every thought in my head went silent. He was tall, that was the first thing. Tall in a way that rearranged the proportions of the garden around him. Dark hair, unruly from the ride, falling across a forehead that was furrowed with an intensity that might have been anger, or might have been concentration, or might have been both. A strong jaw, shadowed with a day's growth he had not bothered to address. Broad shoulders beneath a coat that was notably lighter than the one currently folded in my aunt's wardrobe. But it was his eyes that stopped me. Dark brown, almost black, and burning with a focus so precise it felt like being pinned to a board. "I am looking," he said, "for my coat." His voice was low, clipped, and carried the particular authority of a man who had never in his life needed to raise it. I stood in the garden with a pair of shears in my hand and dead rosemary at my feet, and I knew, with the kind of certainty that arrives like a verdict, that I was looking at the Duke of Ashcroft. The man who had destroyed my father. The man whose coat had saved my life. "I do not know what you mean," I said. His eyes narrowed. He looked at me the way a hawk looks at movement in the grass, patient, precise, and entirely without mercy. A carriage belonging to my household was found overturned 3 nights ago on the Ipswich road. The driver was thrown and broke his collarbone. The horses bolted. A trunk was damaged, its contents scattered. He paused. And a coat was taken, my coat, containing a document I need returned. The letter, the unfinished letter to Ridley. My pulse hammered so loudly I was certain he could hear it. "Perhaps the wind took it," I said. "Or a passing traveller. The road was empty." "The road was empty," he agreed, "which narrows the possibilities considerably. I have spoken to the innkeeper at the crossroads, who recalls no travellers that night. I have spoken to the village constable, who reports no strangers in the area." His gaze moved from my face to the cottage, to the garden, back to me. Except one, a young woman who arrived 3 days ago, in weather no one should have been walking in, wearing a coat that did not belong to her. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the mill stream 50 yards away. "You had better come inside," said Aunt Marian from the doorway, in a voice that suggested she had been listening to every word and had decided that this confrontation was better conducted with walls around it. He sat at Marian's kitchen table like a man who had never been in a kitchen in his life, which he probably had not. He was too large for the chair, too rigid for the room, and his presence filled the space with a tension so thick I could feel it pressing against my skin. Marion placed tea in front of him. He did not touch it. "The coat," he said again. I retrieved it, laid it across the table between us like a gauntlet. His eyes went to it immediately, then to the pocket, and I saw the exact moment he understood that I had found the letter. "You read it," he said, not a question. "Yes." "Then you know what it contains." "I know you wrote to Ridley. I know you suspected him. I know the letter was unfinished." I met his gaze. "What I do not know is whether your suspicion came before or after my father was destroyed." Something shifted in his expression, a hairline fracture in the granite. "Your father." "George Locke, a wool merchant in Norwich. Charles Ridley took everything he had using your name, your connections, and your protection. My father petitioned every authority available to him. Your solicitor blocked each one. My father hanged himself in his study in September. I found his body." My voice was steady. I was distantly amazed by this, by the calm, flat precision with which I was delivering the worst facts of my life to the man responsible for them. "So I will ask again, Your Grace. When did you begin to suspect?" He did not flinch. He did not look away. But I watched the colour leave his face in a slow tide, from his cheeks to his jaw to his throat, until he looked like a man who had been struck and was only now understanding the force of it. "August," he said quietly. 1 month. 1 month before my father died. The Norwich investments were Ridley's operation. I provided introductions and initial capital. I believed it to be a legitimate venture. Ridley had managed similar contracts for 3 years without incident. When irregularities appeared in his accounts last summer, I sent my man Hale to investigate. He paused. His hands, resting on the table, were perfectly still, but I could see the tendons standing out along the backs of them. Hale's findings were not complete until October. By then, my father was dead. Yes. And your solicitor, the one who blocked every petition, acted on standing instructions to protect the estate's interests in any litigation involving our associated ventures. He did not consult me about individual cases. I did not know your father's name until Hale's report landed on my desk. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had not expected and did not want to see. Anguish. Not guilt performed for my benefit. Real, private, grinding anguish. The kind that lives behind a composed face and eats at the foundations. That is not an excuse. It is not an absolution. It is what happened. And Ridley is in custody, as of 10 days ago. I had him arrested myself, which is what I was returning from when the carriage overturned. His jaw tightened. The letter you found was the last communication I sent him before the arrest. I wanted it back because it contains details that could complicate the prosecution. I sat with this. The kitchen was very quiet. Marion stood by the stove, motionless, watching us both. "You want me to believe," I said slowly, "that you did not know what Ridley was doing to my father. I want you to believe the truth. Whether you do is not within my control." And the solicitor? He blocked a dying man's last chance at justice on standing instructions. He has been dismissed. The words were flat, final. As has every member of my legal counsel who touched those cases. I am aware that this is insufficient. I am aware that none of it brings your father back. Then what are you offering? He looked at me with those dark eyes, and I saw the answer before he spoke it. He did not know. He had come for his coat and his letter, and instead found the daughter of a man his negligence had killed. And he had no script for this, no protocol, no precedent in his world of titles and solicitors and standing instructions. "Whatever I can," he said. He did not leave Thornfield that day. I expected him to take his coat, take his letter, and ride back to his estate with the matter concluded. A loose thread tied, a document recovered, a regrettable incident filed under lessons learned. Instead, he asked Marion if there was an inn in the village. "The Red Hart," she said, watching him with the careful expression of a woman who brews remedies for a living and is accustomed to assessing what ails people. Though I cannot imagine what business keeps a duke in a village this size. "Unfinished business," he said, and looked at me. I wanted to hate him. I need you to understand how badly I wanted it. The simplicity of it, the clean fuel of it, the way hatred gives you a direction to walk when grief has taken your compass. For 3 months, the Duke of Ashcroft had been the villain of my story, the name I whispered in the dark when the weight of my father's absence became too much to bear in silence. And now he was sitting in my aunt's kitchen with anguish in his eyes, telling me that Ridley had been arrested, that the solicitor had been dismissed, that he had not known. And the hatred I needed was crumbling at the edges, and what lay beneath it was so much worse. Because beneath hatred was the truth, that my father's death was not the result of a villain's cruelty, but of a system's indifference, of standing instructions and unchecked associates, and a man powerful enough to destroy lives without ever learning the names of the destroyed. And that was not a story with a satisfying enemy. That was just the way the world worked, and it was unbearable. He returned the next morning, and the morning after that. On the first visit, he brought documents, a full accounting of Ridley's operations, prepared by his investigator Hale. Every forged reference, every fictitious contract, every investor who had been deceived. My father's name was on page 14. Seeing it there, printed in a stranger's careful hand between a Suffolk farmer and a Colchester draper, undid something in me that I had been holding together with fury alone. "There are 19 victims," the Duke said. He stood by the window in Marion's sitting room while I read, his hands clasped behind his back, unable to sit. "Your father was not the only one. He was the one who—" He stopped. "He was the one who could not survive it." "Do not," I said, "tell me what my father could not survive." He inclined his head, a concession without argument. I noticed he did this, yielded on points of feeling without yielding on points of fact. It infuriated me. It also disarmed me completely. On the second visit, he brought a letter from his new solicitor, outlining the legal process for recovering assets seized from Ridley's victims. My father's creditors had taken the house, the business, everything. But some of that debt had been artificially inflated by Ridley's manipulations. There was a case to be made, not for full recovery, but for something. "I do not want your charity," I said. "This is not charity, this is restitution. There is a difference, and you are intelligent enough to know it." I looked at him sharply. He met my gaze without flinching, and I realised with a jolt that he was not handling me. He was not performing contrition, or managing my grief, or strategically positioning himself as a benevolent patron. He was simply standing in a room, looking at the damage, and refusing to walk away from it. It was the most dangerous thing he could have done. On the 5th visit, we argued. It was raining again, a persistent grey November drizzle that turned the world to mud and pressed the sky so low it felt like a ceiling. He had come with more documents, and I had refused to look at them. I do not want to read another accounting of how thoroughly your associate destroyed my family. These are not from Hale. They are from your father's own records, recovered from Ridley's offices during the arrest. Letters your father sent to Ridley before he understood what was happening. They may contain information useful to the prosecution. I stared at him. My father's letters. Yes. In Ridley's possession. He kept everything. Meticulous records of his own crimes. It will make the case considerably easier to prove. He held out the packet. I could see my father's handwriting through the thin paper wrapping, that familiar, slightly cramped script that I had grown up watching move across ledgers and prescriptions and the brief, tender notes he left on my breakfast plate when he departed early. I took the packet. My hands were shaking. I opened it and read the first letter, dated April, months before the collapse. And my father's voice came through so clearly that the room blurred and I had to press my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. Dear Mr. Ridley, I write to confirm the terms of our agreement and to express my sincere gratitude for the opportunity. Gratitude. He had been grateful to the man who would destroy him. I set the letter down, I turned away, and the Duke, James Ashcroft, a man I had spent 3 months despising and 5 days failing to despise, did something I did not expect. He said nothing. He did not offer comfort. He did not reach for me. He stood by the window and was silent, and his silence was not empty. It was full of something I recognized, because I carried it too. The particular silence of a person who understands that some pain is too large for words, and that the only respectful response is to stand nearby and bear witness. We stayed like that for a long time. The rain ran down the glass. My father's letters sat on the table, and something between us shifted, not toward warmth, not toward forgiveness, but toward a kind of honesty that was more frightening than either. December. The case against Ridley proceeded. The Duke, I still could not call him James, not even in my mind, not yet, rode to London twice to give testimony, and each time he returned to Thornfield rather than remaining at his townhouse. Marion noticed. He has a London house, a country estate, and every comfort a man of his station could want, she said one evening, measuring dried chamomile into a muslin pouch with surgical precision. And yet he keeps returning to a village with one inn, one church, and one angry young woman who will not forgive him. I am not angry. Marion looked at me over her spectacles. I am not only angry, I amended. No, she agreed. You are not. The visits had changed. They were no longer about documents and restitution. He came to the cottage and we walked, along the mill stream, through the bare winter fields, once as far as the edge of his own estate, where the Ashcroft land began, and the tenant farms spread out below us in a patchwork of brown and grey. He talked. Not about my father. That subject we circled carefully, approaching and retreating like two people navigating ice that might not hold. He talked about the estate, about the tenants, about the weight of inheriting a dukedom at 23 from a father who had treated the title as a license for indifference. He was not cruel, he said, on one of those walks. Cruelty requires attention. He simply did not care. The tenants, the staff, the land, all of it was machinery to him. It produced income. What happened inside the machinery was not his concern. And you? I swore I would be different. I restructured the tenancies, rebuilt the cottages, pensioned the elderly workers. And then I hired Ridley to expand the commercial operations, because I was 25 and believed that good intentions were sufficient protection against bad men. He stopped walking. The wind pressed his coat flat against his frame and pushed his dark hair across his forehead, and he looked, in that moment, less like a duke, and more like a man carrying something he could not set down. I was wrong, and your father paid for it. Yes, I said. He did. We stood in the cold field with the wind between us, and I felt the last wall of pure hatred give way. Not into forgiveness, not into absolution, but into something more complicated and more honest. The recognition that this man was not the monster I had needed him to be, that he was a flawed and grieving person who had failed in ways that cost other people their lives, and that he knew it, and that the knowing was eating him alive. I did not want to feel sympathy for him. Sympathy was a betrayal of my father's memory. But I looked at his face in the grey December light, and I felt it anyway, and it was terrible. Christmas arrived like an unwelcome guest. The village celebrated. Marion made plum cake from my mother's recipe and placed an extra slice on the table as though expecting a visitor. He came at noon. He brought a gift, not for me, but for Marion. A set of glass apothecary jars, precisely the kind she needed for her remedies, chosen with an attention to detail that meant he had been listening when she mentioned the cracked ones. Marion accepted them with a look that said, "I see exactly what you are doing, and also, these are excellent jars." For me, he brought nothing. This was correct. A gift would have been presumptuous, an attempt to purchase something that was not for sale. I appreciated the restraint, even as some small, treacherous part of me noticed its absence. After dinner, Marion announced she was tired and excused herself with the transparent determination of a woman engineering a moment. We sat in the parlour by the fire, the Duke and I, in a silence that had become almost comfortable. Almost, but not quite, because underneath the comfort ran a current so strong I could feel it humming in my teeth. "I read my father's letters," I said. "All of them." He looked at me, waiting. "The last one. The one he wrote in September. The week before he..." I steadied myself. He wrote to Ridley, asking for more time. Begging, really. He offered to sell everything if Ridley would simply extend the payment schedule by 6 months. He said he had a daughter to provide for. The fire crackled. The Duke's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "Ridley never responded," I said. "But I think you know that." "I know that." "If your investigation had been faster, if you had suspected sooner, if your solicitor had not blocked the petitions, if any single piece of the machinery you built had worked differently, he might be alive. Yes, I know that too." I looked at him across the firelight, and his face was open in a way I had never seen. Stripped of composure, stripped of control. Just a man sitting with the full weight of what his carelessness had cost, and not turning away from it. "I cannot forgive you," I said. "Not yet. Perhaps not ever. I am not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" He was silent for a long time. The fire shifted and settled. When he spoke, his voice was rough, as though the words had been lodged somewhere inaccessible and were tearing free. "I am asking you to let me stay. Not stay in the cottage, not stay in the village. Stay in my life. Stay in the space between hatred and trust, between guilt and atonement, between the man who had failed my father and the man who was trying, imperfectly, stubbornly, without excuse, to answer for it. Stay, I whispered, and did not know, even as I said it, whether I meant, you may remain, or please do not leave. Perhaps both. Perhaps that was the most honest answer available. January. The Ridley trial was set for the Hillary term. The Duke's solicitor wrote to inform me that preliminary rulings had gone favourably. Several of Ridley's victims would receive partial restitution. My father's estate was among them. Not full recovery, but enough to settle the remaining debts and leave a small sum. I wept when I read the letter. Not from relief, the money was almost beside the point. I wept because my father had died believing that no one would fight for him, and someone had. Too late, but someone had. The Duke did not come that day. Mrs. Marion told me later that he had been seen at the church, sitting alone in a back pew for over an hour. The vicar, uncertain whether to approach a duke who appeared to be in distress, had wisely left him alone. I went to him. I do not know what compelled me. Every rational instinct said to keep my distance, to accept the restitution, to let the trial proceed, to maintain the careful boundary between a victim and the man adjacent to the crime. But I had spent 3 months hating him and 2 months knowing him, and the knowing had become a weight I could not carry alone. He was still in the church when I arrived. The building was empty and cold, the winter light filtering through plain glass windows onto stone floors worn smooth by centuries. He sat in the last row, his head bowed, his hands clasped in front of him, and he did not look up when the door opened. I sat beside him. The pew was hard and cold. Our shoulders were 6 inches apart. "The restitution came through," I said.
"I know. Thank you." He turned his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his expression, that careful, controlled, ducal composure, was in ruins. He looked like a man who had been dismantling himself brick by brick and had finally reached the foundation. "Do not thank me," he said. "I am the reason it was necessary." "You were also the reason it happened. Both things are true. I am tired of pretending only one of them counts." Something broke in his face. Not dramatically. No sound, no tears. Just a fracture that ran from his eyes to the set of his mouth. And behind it I could see everything he had been holding in place. The guilt, the grief, the desperate want to undo what could not be undone. And something else. Something that looked at me with a hunger so raw it stole my breath. Arabella. My name in his mouth for the first time. Not Miss Locke. Arabella. Spoken like a confession in the cold church air. James. His name in mine. Crossing a line we both knew we could not uncross. He reached for my hand, slowly, giving me time to pull away, time to refuse, time to remember who he was and what he had cost me. I did not pull away. His fingers closed around mine, warm and firm and shaking, and the touch was so charged I felt it travel up my arm and lodge behind my ribs like something that had always belonged there. We sat in the empty church with our hands joined and the winter light falling around us, and neither of us spoke, because there was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. The scandal broke in February. Not from the village. Thornfield had accepted the Duke's visits with the pragmatic discretion of a community that depended on his goodwill. It came from London. Ridley's trial had drawn attention, and a society columnist, the kind who treated other people's pain as entertainment, had connected the pieces. The Duke of Ashcroft, personally pursuing a fraud case. A young woman, the daughter of one of the victims, residing suspiciously near his estate. The Duke's repeated visits to an obscure Suffolk village with no apparent business purpose. The column did not name me. It did not need to. It described a young woman of no family and reduced circumstances, and let its readers fill in the rest. Lady Ashcroft,
The Duke's widowed sister-in-law, who managed his London household and considered herself the guardian of the family name, descended on Thornfield with the speed and devastation of a winter storm. She arrived at Marian's cottage without warning, without introduction, and without the slightest interest in pleasantries. "You will end this," she said, standing in the doorway with the cold pouring in behind her. "Whatever this is, and I assure you the London papers have theories, it ends now. I do not know what you believe is happening. I believe my brother-in-law has lost his mind, and you are the proximate cause. He has spent 2 months attending to the daughter of a man ruined by his own associate. And however noble his intentions may have begun, the optics are now catastrophic." She stepped inside without invitation, her gaze sweeping the cottage with undisguised contempt. "He cannot marry you. Surely you understand that." The word marry landed in the room like a cannon shot. It had not been spoken between us, not by James, not by me, not even in the private theatre of my own imagination, where I had carefully avoided giving the feeling a name. "No one has spoken of marriage," I said. "Then you are either blind or lying. He looks at you the way he used to look at his dogs, as though you are the only uncomplicated thing in his life. And I promise you, Miss Locke, you are not uncomplicated. You are a liability." Marian appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Lady Ashcroft, you are a guest in my home, and you will moderate your language or you will leave it." Lady Ashcroft turned to Marian with the expression of a woman unaccustomed to being addressed by anyone who did not curtsy first. For a moment, the room balanced on a knife's edge. Then the cottage door opened again, and James walked in. He took in the scene, his sister-in-law rigid with fury, Marian braced in the kitchen doorway, me standing in the centre of the room with my hands clenched at my sides, and his expression went very still. Not cold, not angry. The stillness of a man who has been expecting a reckoning and is almost relieved it has finally arrived. "Catherine," he said, "I was not aware you were visiting." "Someone had to intervene before you destroyed what remains of this family's reputation." "My reputation is my concern. Your reputation is the family's concern. You are the Duke of Ashcroft. Every choice you make reflects on a family name that sheltered a swindler for 3 years and allowed 19 people to be ruined, including the father of the woman standing in front of you." His voice had dropped to that low, lethal register I had heard once before, in the kitchen, the first day, when he had absorbed the news of my father's death. "If the family name can survive that, Catherine, it can survive whatever the gossip columns invent about my movements in Suffolk. This is not about gossip. This is about a duke who has clearly formed an attachment to a woman with no fortune, no family, and a direct grievance against his household. The ton will not see nobility in this, James. They will see weakness, or worse, guilt masquerading as affection." The silence that followed was absolute. I felt the words land, not because they were cruel, but because they articulated the fear I had carried for weeks. The fear that what James felt for me was not love, but penance. That I was not his choice, but his punishment. That he came to Thornfield not because he wanted me, but because he could not stop atoning. James looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the answer, the real one, underneath the guilt and the grief and the weight of the title, and the ruined father, and the stolen coat, and every impossible thing that had brought us to this room. He was not atoning. He was burning. "Catherine," he said, without looking away from me, "I am going to ask you to leave. James, I will address your concerns in London, in writing, at my earliest convenience. But you will leave this cottage,
and you will leave this woman in peace. That is not a request." Lady Ashcroft held her ground for 3 seconds. Then something in his expression, something I could see from across the room, fierce and absolute and entirely beyond negotiation, made her pick up her gloves and walk out. The door closed. We stood in Marian's parlour. The fire crackled. My heart was hammering so violently I could feel it in my wrists. "She is not wrong," I said. "About any of it. The optics, the liability, She is wrong about one thing." He crossed the room. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the pulse in his throat, the slight tremor in his jaw, the way his eyes had gone dark and urgent. "She said I look at you like something uncomplicated. That is the opposite of the truth. You are the most complicated thing that has ever happened to me. You are the daughter of a man my negligence killed, and I think about that every day. And I also think about the way you stood in your aunt's garden with shears in your hand and lied to my face about my coat. And He stopped. His composure, the last of it, the final crumbling wall, gave way. "I love you," he said. "And I know I have no right to. And I know the world will say it is guilt or Saviour's vanity or a duke's whim. I do not care what the world says. I care what you say." I looked at this man, this impossible, infuriating, devastating man who had come for his coat and stayed for his conscience, and somewhere along the way had become the only person in the world who made me feel like I was standing on solid ground. "I say," I whispered, "that you should have brought me a Christmas present." He stared at me. And then, for the first time since I had known him, he laughed. A real laugh, startled and helpless, and it broke the tension so completely that I was laughing too, and then I was crying, and then his hands were on my face, his thumbs tracing my cheekbones, and he kissed me, softly. Not the desperate collision I might have expected, but something careful and deliberate and achingly gentle, as though I were something he had broken once and was terrified of breaking again. I kissed him back, with all the grief and fury and impossible, unwanted, undeniable love that had been building in me since the day I stole his coat on the coldest night of my life. When we separated, his forehead rested against mine. "Your father," he said quietly. "If I could go back." "I know." I pressed my hand against his chest, over his heart. "I know you would. That is not nothing, James." "Is it enough?" I thought about my father, about his letters, his kindness, his quiet dignity, the unbearable gratitude he had offered to the man who would ruin him. I thought about the study and the mourning and the shape of a world that allows good men to be swallowed by indifferent machinery. And I thought about a coat in a ditch and a letter that proved the Duke had been trying, too late, but trying, to stop the machine. "It is a beginning," I said. We married in April, in the church where he had sat alone with his guilt, and I had sat beside him and taken his hand. The ton talked. Of course they talked. The Duke of Ashcroft marrying the penniless daughter of a man destroyed by his own associate. It was the kind of story that fed drawing rooms for months. Some called it romantic. Some called it scandalous. Lady Ashcroft called it regrettable, though she attended the wedding in a new gown, which Marian observed was its own kind of concession. The Ridley trial concluded in March. He was found guilty on all counts. Restitution was ordered. It would not bring back the dead or undo the ruined years, but it placed on public record that what had happened was a crime, not a misfortune. My father's name was cleared.
I stood in the gallery when the verdict was read and felt something shift in my chest. Not closure, nothing so clean, but a loosening, as though a knot that had been pulled tight since September had finally been allowed to ease. James stood beside me. He did not touch me. He did not need to. His presence was enough, solid, steady, and permanent in a way I was only beginning to trust. In June, I returned to the Ipswich road. James drove the carriage himself, a fact that horrified his coachman and amused Marion, who had come along in a spirit of what she called historical interest. We stopped at the crossroads where I had found the overturned carriage 6 months earlier. The ditch had been repaired. The road was dry and summer warm. There was no trace of the night that had changed everything. I stepped down from the carriage and stood where I had stood in the freezing dark, shaking, desperate, reaching for a coat that did not belong to me. James came to stand beside me. He wore a new greatcoat, charcoal wool, silver buttons, and without a word, he shrugged it off and draped it around my shoulders. It was warm from his body, and it smelled of cedar and ink, and I pulled it tight around myself and laughed, because what else can you do when the worst night of your life turns into the beginning of the only life you ever wanted? "For the record," he said, "I would have given it to you." "I know," I said, "but I was not in the habit of asking dukes for favours." "And now?" I looked at him, this man who had been my villain and my rescuer and my adversary and my beloved, who had come for his coat and stayed for his life. And I took his hand. "Now I am in the habit of taking what I need," I said, "and keeping it." He kissed me on the Ipswich road in the June sunlight, and I kept the coat.